Thank you very much for the intro, Vitaly. I think this is my fourth, maybe my fifth MarketingTO, but it's my first time presenting, so I'm very excited to be up here. Hopefully share a few pieces of wisdom to spark some of the conversation tonight. I will start by saying when Alex reached out to me after the October MarketingTO to ask me if I would speak at this session, my first reaction was, I'm interested, tell me a little bit more. And she said, well, what's the topic? And she said, well, the future of martech. And my initial reaction, well, I'm not sure that I have anything to share on that topic. I'm not going to be talking about where programmatic is going, where AI is going, or any of the technologies. So I took the tack of really talking a little bit about tonight. The future of martech, from my perspective, is at the end of the day, human. And what I mean by that is if we think about marketing, certainly over the last decade, I would say even accelerated over the last few years, we've moved well beyond the world of pray and spray, putting campaigns out there and hoping they get response. We've really moved into the world of conversations. And when I say conversations, I'm not talking about social media, but rather the fact that a brand is a promise. A brand is also now a dialogue with its audience. And sometimes, I think when we talk about the technology that powers that, we lose sight of the human element of that. And if that's kind of the thesis or the core of my thesis that I'm going to talk about tonight, that's really it, is getting back to the basics of, at the core of everything we're doing, we're talking about human beings, and we're talking about human interactions. I chose this image. I love this image. Actually, there's a LinkedIn article I wrote, which features this image. It's a 3D projection map on top of a bridge. I think the bridge is actually in Brisbane. But if you can take a look, it looks like, at first glance, there's no 3D projection there. It looks like a steel bridge, but it's actually a concrete bridge with a steel 3D projection over top of it. And the reason I love this image is because if you look at it and you think about martech or technology, art, and science, really, it blends. Everything is blending together. Is the technology the 3D projection on the bridge? Is the art the 3D projection on the bridge? Is the technology the engineering that went into building the bridge? Or is the art the architecture and the beautiful design of the bridge? So when I think about where things are going, one of the macro trends is I see the worlds really starting to blend and meld together to the point where in the future, we won't be able to tell what is art, what is science. It's really seamless. And if I think about my own journey in the marketing world, I actually started out, believe it or not, as an engineer. So an engineer who knew he was not on a path to be a traditional engineer. And early on in my career, I was frequently asked, an engineer working in marketing, what the heck is that? Like, what's that all about? And flash forward some years later, today, when I say I'm an engineer working in marketing, I'm like, of course, that makes perfect sense, because a lot of what we do now is really driven by analytics, data, all these things that we need to be really comfortable with, and comfortable moving between the creative, the strategy, and the technology. And that, to me, is kind of the triangle, the pillars. I'll share this quote. I know you can all read it on screen, but I'm also going to read it. So, any intelligent fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. Any guesses who said this? No Googling. And no looking at Jed's stream, because I think he might have posted something similar. All right. Full disclosure, this is, of course, the infamous marketer, Albert Einstein. And I love this quote because, back to, again, the worlds colliding, obviously he wasn't talking about marketing when he said this, but when we think about our roles and even the image that Santa put up in her presentation with the 6,000 plus platforms, complexity is easy. What's really hard is to simplify. And I think more and more and more our roles as marketers, it's about simplifying and focusing and getting down to what are we really actually trying to do for the business. Vitaly touched on some of my musical, yes, I do play musical instruments. I like to think, an analogy I like to think of marketers in today's world, we're really orchestra conductors. So we have a whole bunch of channels at our disposal. We have a whole bunch of data at our disposal. And our role is to stay true to the strategy, or the score in the case of an orchestra, and keep the team and keep the deliverables moving towards that. So I really like this image because, again, partly because of my background, but also I think it's an apt analogy for where we are today. Someone I worked with back in the day once described the skill sets required, and this was probably 10 years ago, to work in marketing as really being able to skim over the top of the surface of a lake and then be able to dive down and then come right back up and keep skimming along. Being it's December, not quite winter, I think we've still got one more week and we're in Canada, I chose this image of a skating rink, or actually it's a lake near Banff. So I think, again, that notion of the T skill, which I think everyone's heard that terminology, becomes more and more true, especially as we get more senior in marketing roles. Being able to see the big picture at any given moment in time, might happen multiple times during the day, being able to dive deep down, come right back up, but always keep that big picture in view. We as marketers, I would say, sometimes get distracted by the bright, shiny objects. We swing towards the pendulum of whatever the tool or the flavor of the day. Not all the time, but sometimes. And I love this image because I actually think today it's even more complex than that. We're actually getting pulled in multiple directions at all times, and we're getting squeezed in the middle and having to make decisions and having to make choices on the fly. For anyone that hasn't heard about this gentleman, Dan Pontefract, I would encourage you to check out his latest book. This is Open to Think. He was, actually up until today, the chief envisioner for TELUS. He's now actually out on his own. The thesis of this book is really about, again, one of the things that we need to do as marketers, which is slow down. The pace is so quick, and sometimes we tend to react because we need to react. And we don't slow down. And critical thinking, I think, as marketers, is a skill set that is in high demand. People need to focus more and slow down to think creatively. I sometimes envision our marketing role as a game of Tetris, where there's a project or an initiative that comes into our view. We've got to quickly maneuver it, figure out how it fits. Everything drops off the bottom of the screen, and then there's the next thing that we've got to deal with. And we don't take the time to actually critically think. So if you don't know Dan Pontefract, you don't know his latest book, I would encourage you to check it out. Again, it's not marketing specific, but that notion of thinking creatively and strategic thinking applies. And then, as Vitaly pointed out, I've had the good fortune of, I worked in agency for about 15 years. I worked at Sick Kids for about 6 years. Now I'm at Kids Help Phone. So I've had the good fortune of finding literally purpose in the work I'm doing. But again, I think as marketers, we do have purpose, and sometimes we've drifted away from that. So I like the Peter Drucker quote, who, for those who don't know Peter Drucker, famous business consultant, strategist. He talked about the role of a marketer as understanding your audience so well that the product or service that you have sells itself. That's his definition of marketing. So purpose, we have a purpose as marketers. You don't have to be working in a purpose-driven industry, but again, sometimes we drift away from that purpose. And then I'll close with this thought, kind of rounding out the notion of humanity. Ultimately, back to the bridge image, I think martech and all these things that we're dealing with today will eventually just become part of our marketing DNA, and will continue to evolve. They'll be the next whatever comes along. And I do believe firmly, until we start marketing to robots, or robots start marketing to each other, humans are going to be at the core of what we do. So that is how I will close my presentation, and I encourage you to connect with me either now or in the future. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so this is the opportunity to ask Mark questions.
Hi. So my question was, you talk about purpose and always maintaining your humanity in marketing. My question is, how do you navigate that when you're sort of in the thick of this is my budget and kind of like cutthroat industry, and I gotta do my job and I gotta get a promotion? Like, how do you maintain that balance?
It's a great question, and today I am not in that world, I would say, or those are not qualities that I would use to describe Kid's Cell Phone. Having worked in the agency world, certainly more of those qualities might have applied, but I think it is really about, at the end of the day, it's the basics. So when you look at the problem you're faced with, not starting with jumping to doing, but really questioning. And I think, again, our role as marketers is to ask the questions back to the business. So why are we doing this? Who's the audience? What do they think about us? What do they feel about us? What do we want them to think about us? Those are questions that quite often we skip over. And I remember in my early agency days, we used to literally put line items in proposals for strategy that were the first things to get struck out, right? When you're cutting budget, oh, we're not going to do the strategy piece. Well, you can do it now, or you can do it 8 weeks from now when we're completely off the rails and we need to go backwards. So I think it is really about, we tend to think we can just move forward, do things, and not pausing and thinking strategically actually will benefit the business in the long term as well, to your point around delivering results at the end of the day, which is what we're trying to do.
Hello. Here.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. You talked about the role of technology in marketing and about 6,000 different platforms that are bombarded on marketers. How should a marketer go about choosing what technology is right for me or for my brand or for my agency and going into the future?
Yeah, I think part of it is not necessarily aligning yourself with one particular technology. Again, it's about what makes sense in terms of if these are your objectives, how you're trying to reach your audience, what are the tools and technologies that match with that, not necessarily aligning yourself to one particular technology. That's the reality. I mean, you might have partnerships that are longer term partnerships rooted in specific areas of technology, but I think back to that 6,000, you're not going to be implementing, I don't know what percentage of that you could realistically implement. It's going to be about what are you trying to do, what's going to reach my audience, enable the experience I'm trying to create, and look through it with that lens versus here's a cool platform, I'm going to back it into what might help me or not, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Mark. Please find Mark